Hi everyone, so here we are with chapter 16. I'll turn the brightness up so you can see it. Bert says goodbye. Spittleworth noticed a commotion beside the palace walls and strained to see what was going on. When he spotted the woman on the ground and heard the cries of shock and pity, he suddenly realised that he'd left a loose end that might yet trip him up. The widow. As he rode past the little knot of people in the crowd who were fanning Mrs. Beamish's face, Spittleworth knew that his longed-for bath must be postponed, and his crafty brain began to race again. Once the king's party was safely in the courtyard, and servants had hurried to assist Fred from his horse, Spittleworth pulled Major Roach aside. "The widow, Beamish's widow," he muttered. "Why didn't you send her word about his death?" "It never occurred to me, my lord," said Roach truthfully. He'd been too busy thinking about the jewelled sword and all the way home, how best to sell it, and whether it would be better to break it up into pieces so that nobody recognised it. "Curse you, Roach! Must I think of everything?" snarled Spittleworth. "Go now. Take Beamish's body out of those filthy cloaks, cover it with the cornucopian flag, and lay him out in the blue parlour. Put guards on the door, and then bring Mrs. Beamish to me in the throne room. Also, give the order that these soldiers must not go home or talk to their families until I've spoken to them. It's essential that we all tell the same story. Now hurry, fool, hurry. Beamish's widow could ruin everything." Spittleworth pushed his way past the soldiers and stable boys to where Flapoon was being lifted off his horse. "Keep the king away from the throne room and the blue parlour," Spittleworth whispered in Flapoon's ear. "Encourage him to go to bed." Flapoon nodded, and Spittleworth hurried away through the dimly lit palace corridors, casting off his dusty riding coat as he went, and bellowing at the servants to fetch him fresh clothes. Once in the deserted throne room, Spittleworth pulled on his clean jacket and ordered a maid to light a single lamp and bring him a glass of wine. Then he waited. At last there came a knock on the door. "Enter!" shouted Spittleworth, and in came Major Roach, accompanied by a white-faced Mrs. Beamish and a young Bert. "Mrs. Beamish, my very dear Mrs. Beamish," said Spittleworth, striding towards her and clasping her free hand. "The king has asked me to tell you how deeply sorry he is. I add my own condolences. What a tragedy! What an awful tragedy!" "Why did nobody send word?" sobbed Mrs. Beamish. Why did we have to find out by seeing his poor body?" She swayed a little, and Roach hurried to fetch a small golden chair. The maid, who was called Hetty, arrived with wine for Spittleworth, and while she was pouring it, Spittleworth said, "Dear, dear lady, we did in fact send word. We sent a messenger, didn't we, Roach?" "That's right," said Roach. "We sent a young lad called—" But here Roach got stuck. He was a man of very little imagination. "Nobby," said Spittleworth, saying the first name that came to his head. "Little Nobby Buttons," he added, because the flickering lamplight had just illuminated one of Roach's golden buttons. "Yes, little Nobby Buttons volunteered, and off he galloped." "What could have become of him, Roach?" said Spittleworth. "We must send out a search party at once to see whether any trace of Nobby Buttons can be found." "At once, my lord," said Roach, bowing deeply, and he left. How did my husband die?" whispered Mrs. Beamish. "Well, madam," said Spittleworth, speaking carefully, for he knew that the story he told now would become the official version, and that he'd have to stick by it forevermore. "As you may have heard, we journeyed to the marshlands because we'd received word that the Ickabog had carried off a dog. Shortly after our arrival, I regret to say, our entire party was attacked by the monster. It lunged for the king first, but he fought most bravely, sinking his sword into the monster's neck. To the tough-skinned Ickabog, however, 'twas but a wasp sting. Enraged, it sought further victims, and though Major Beamish put up his most heroic struggle, I regret to say he laid down his life for the king. Then Lord Flapoon had the excellent notion of firing his blunderbuss, which scared the Ickabog away. We brought poor Beamish out of the marsh, asked for a volunteer to take news of the death to his family. Dear little Nobby Button said he'd do it, and leapt onto his horse, and until we reached Shoeville, I never doubted he'd arrive to give you warning of this dreadful tragedy." Can I see my husband?" wept Mrs. Beamish. Of course, he's in the blue parlour." He led Mrs. Beamish and Bert, who was still clutching his mother's hand, to the door of the parlour, where he paused. "I regret that we cannot remove the flag covering him. His injuries would be far too distressing for you to see. The fang and claw marks, you know." Mrs. Beamish swayed yet again, and Bert grabbed hold of her to keep her upright. Now Lord Flapoon walked up to the group, holding a tray of pies. "King's in bed," he said thickly to Spittleworth. "Oh, hello," he added, looking at Mrs. Beamish, who was one of the few servants whose names he knew, because she baked the pastries. "Sorry about the Major," said Flapoon, spraying Mrs. Beamish and Bert with crumbs of pie crust. "Always liked him." He walked away, leaving Spittleworth to open the door of the blue parlour to let Mrs. Beamish and Bert inside. There lay the body of Major Beamish, concealed behind the cornucopian flag. "Can I at least kiss him one last time?" sobbed Mrs. Beamish. "Quite impossible, I'm afraid," said Spittleworth. "His face is half gone." "His hand, mother," said Bert, speaking for the first time. "I'm sure his hand will be all right." And before Spittleworth could stop the boy, Bert reached underneath the flag for his father's hand, which was quite unmarked. Mrs. Beamish knelt down and kissed the hand over and over until it shone with tears, as though made of porcelain. Then Bert helped her to her feet, and the two of them left the blue parlour without another word. Chapter 17. Goodfellow makes a stand. Having watched the Beamishes out of sight, Spittleworth hurried off to the guard-room, where he found Roach keeping watch over the rest of the Royal Guard. The walls of the room were hung with swords and portraits of King Fred, whose eyes seemed to watch everything that was happening. "They've gone restless, my lord," muttered Roach. "They want to go home to their families and get to bed." "And so they shall, once we've had a little chat," said Spittleworth, moving to face the weary and travel-stained soldiers. "Has anyone got any questions about what happened in the marshlands?" he asked the man. The soldiers looked at each other. Some of them stole furtive glances at Roach, who'd retreated against the wall and was polishing a rifle. Then Captain Goodfellow raised his hand along with two other soldiers. "Why was Beamish's body wrapped up before any of us could look at it?" asked Captain Goodfellow. "I want to know whether that bullet went, that we heard being fired," said the second soldier. "How come only 4 people saw this monster if it's so huge?" asked the third, to general nods and muttering of agreement. "All excellent questions," replied Spittleworth smoothly. "Let me explain," and he repeated the story of the attack he told Mrs. Beamish. The soldiers who'd asked the questions remained unsatisfied. "I still reckon that's funny that a huge monster was out there and none of us saw it," said the third. "If Beamish was half eaten, why wasn't there more blood?" asked the second. "And who in the name of all that is holy," said Captain Goodfellow, "is Nobby Buttons?" "How do you know about Nobby Buttons?" blurted Spittleworth without thinking. "On my way here from the stables I bumped into one of the maids. Hetty," said Goodfellow. "She served your wine, my lord. According to her, you've just been telling Beamish's poor wife about a member of the Royal Guard called Nobby Buttons. According to you, Nobby Buttons has been sent with a message to Beamish's wife telling her he'd been killed. But I don't remember a Nobby Buttons. I've never met anyone called Nobby Buttons. So I ask you, my lord, how can that be? How can a man ride with us and camp with us and take orders from your lordship right in front of us without any of us ever clapping eyes on him?" Spittleworth's first thought was that he'd have to do something about that eavesdropping maid. Luckily, Goodfellow had given him her name. Then he said in a dangerous voice, "What gives you the right to speak for everybody, Captain Goodfellow? Perhaps some of these men have better memories than you do. Perhaps they remember poor Nobby Buttons clearly. Dear little Nobby, whose memory the king will add a fat bag of gold to everybody's pay this week. Proud, brave Nobby, whose sacrifice, for I fear the monster has eaten him as well as Beamish, may mean a pay rise for all his comrades in arms. Noble Nobby Buttons, whose closest friends are surely marked for speedy promotion." Another silence followed Spittleworth's words, and this silence had a cold, heavy quality. Now the whole Royal Guard understood the choice facing them. They weighed in their minds the huge influence Spittleworth was known to have over the king, and the fact that Major Roach was now caressing the barrel of his rifle in a menacing manner, and they remembered the sudden death of their former leader, Major Beamish. They also considered the promise of more gold and speedy promotion if they agreed to believe in the Ickabog and in private Nobby Buttons. Goodfellow stood up so suddenly that his chair clattered to the floor. "There never was a Nobby Buttons, and I'm damned if there's an Ickabog. I won't be party to a lie." The other 2 men who'd asked questions stood up as well, but the rest of the Royal Guard remained seated, silent and watchful. "Very well," said Spittleworth. "You 3 are under arrest for the filthy crime of treason. As I'm sure your comrades remember, you ran away when the Ickabog appeared. You forgot your duty to protect the king and thought only of saving your own cowardly hides. The penalty is death by firing squad. He shows 8 soldiers to take the 3 men away, and even though the 3 honest soldiers struggled very hard, they were outnumbered and overwhelmed, and in no time at all they'd been dragged out of the guard's room. Very good, said Spittleworth to the few soldiers remaining. Very good indeed. There will be pay rises all round. I shall not remember, and I shall remember your names when it comes to promotions. Now don't forget to tell your families exactly what happened in the marshlands. It might bode ill for your wives, your parents, and your children if they're heard to question the existence of the Ickabog or of Nobby Buttons. You may now return home. Well, Spittleworth creating a very nasty plan, hasn't he? I hope Captain Goodfellow doesn't get shot. So today in your Purple Mash activity, you are going to answer the question of how do you know that Captain Goodfellow is a good character? How do you know he's a good person? So if I were you, I'd think about him, what he's done in this chapter, which is chapter 17. So how do you know that he's a good person? And remember, you need to put a quote in, but I'll set it all up so that you can follow the sections, and I'll put the sentence starters on as well to help you. But I'll see you all tomorrow to see what happens and whether or not we find out any more about Captain Goodfellow.